Good morning. Okay, so thank you all for coming. So the talk will be in English. I'll try to speak clearly. But feel free, if you have questions, feel free to just stop me, jump in. We can have more of a conversation. So yeah, let's get started. So again, this talk will be about Flutter, about sharing kind of my experiences over this past year. So to start, a bit about who I am. My name is Hillel Coren. I'm one of the co-founders of Invoice Ninja, and we're one of the leading open source invoicing platforms. So quick story, this isn't really talk about my company, but I'll share one idea I think is very interesting I think has been key to our success, is offering both a hosted and self-host solution. So essentially our software is completely open source, and you can use it on our servers, invoiceninja.com, or you can take the code, kind of like WordPress, and run it on your own servers. And we found that one idea has been key to our success, where fundamentally you're dealing with two different types of people. Right? There are people who just want a service that works, and they'll go to invoiceninja.com. But the people who want to run themselves are generally much more technical. And it's kind of combining those two groups really has enabled us to be successful. So quick backstory. So we built a big web app about 5 years ago using Laravel and PHP. And then we randomly got an email from somebody out of the blue saying, hey, you guys need mobile apps. And he agreed to build us native apps. So we built us a native Android app and a native iPhone app. And then we released them to the store, and not so good. They're okay. The challenge we had, and again, I think many people have the same problem, is that I was full-time building the web app, adding features constantly, and my partner was part-time building 2 mobile apps. And it's a classic problem, where I would add a new feature to the web app, he'd have to then implement that feature twice on 2 separate platforms. And fundamentally, I believe that the challenge to building a great app isn't about the technology you're using, it's fundamentally about developer resources. You know, do you have the developers available to spend the time building a great app? And we fundamentally did not have that. We were a tiny company with 2 developers, and as a result, the mobile apps really suffered. Where we wouldn't build the best apps possible, we would build the most acceptable apps possible. Where we simply would check boxes and make sure we had the features we needed, but we didn't have the time to build it as optimally as we would have liked to. So Flutter, why we're here. Flutter is awesome. I'm a big proponent. I will be very clear, I am incredibly biased. You're speaking to someone who's completely subjective. I love Flutter. I've been doing it for about full-time for about a year now, and we've had great results. I'm a GDE. I'm a Google Developer Expert. I think I'm the first one in Israel for Flutter. So I have a good relationship with the Flutter team. And I can tell you firsthand, it's being developed by an incredibly passionate team of engineers. And the one point I'll just make about Flutter is, I mean, just show of hands, how many people have actually developed with Flutter at all? A little bit? Okay, a few people. Hopefully next year, even more. I think the one key to Flutter, I think a lot of people kind of will read a guide or tutorial and say, hey, this is what Flutter's about, and give you a sense for it. And from my experience, it really isn't quite enough. I think it's worthwhile spending a few hours to set up an environment and just do a little bit of coding. And it's just that little bit, a half hour of real development with Flutter, I think gives you a much better sense for its possibilities. So again, it's hard in a talk to kind of explain Flutter in detail. This talk is really aimed more at advanced Flutter developers. It was written kind of just to get people really dealing with complex apps, and I think the audience here is maybe more beginner Flutter. So if you have any questions, feel free to jump in. I'm happy to answer any background questions about Flutter and its technology. I will say, when I first learned about Flutter, it seemed absurd to me. It seemed just crazy, right? Because I mean, if you know React Native, it's a very clever solution, right? You take the actual UI components and you wire them up, and you're getting real native components. Flutter is called native, right? But native is a very subjective word. So it's native in the sense that it is native compilation. You know, it compiles to native code, but the UI elements are not native, right? They're actually rebuilding all the elements, which again seems absurd, but only a company like Google have the resources to do that. So essentially, when you see UI elements that are Android elements or iOS elements, again, they literally use slow motion cameras to capture the interactions and re-implement them, which again seems crazy, but it works. It works, and it has some tremendous benefits. So just a couple of big background about Flutter. I noticed earlier on, I think one of the first developers asked about Flutter. And it seemed like the response was maybe Flutter's more for toys, right, or for games. But again, I would say from our experience that Flutter's at a stage now where it can really be built for anything. And through the talk, I'll show you some of the things we built. But again, the one key point here I'd like to make is try it yourself. You know, try it, run with it. I think the one issue a lot of people are nervous about Flutter is that it's written with Dart. So who uses Dart, right? Nobody uses Dart. I remember when it first came out, it seemed like a really cool language, but it really didn't get much popularity. But I will say, if you're a programmer, you kind of already know Dart. Dart was designed to be kind of uninteresting and unexciting. It's pretty boring, but it looks just like any other language you use, and will be very comfortable for most programmers. So Picture's worth 1,000 words. So this is the stars on the GitHub project. And you can see a very clear trajectory. And you kind of see the inflection point was last March. And that was when Flutter announced their first major beta. This is actually when we got involved as a company. And you'll see very clearly the trajectory is kind of straight up. Again, I think this is for a reason. I've been building apps for about 20 years now. And it's clear to me that Flutter is the best it's been. If you're building UIs, it's hard to compete with the experience Flutter provides. So let's get into actually developing with Flutter. One of the first big questions you need to ask is state management. And this is probably a common question coming from React, if you're coming from Android. Where do you put your data? Where do you store your state? And so just very quickly, this is kind of the most common options. I won't go into detail, but set state is kind of what comes packaged in. And it's just simply a way of saying, hey, the state has changed, rebuild the UI to match it. And it works very simple apps, but for complex apps, it starts to fall apart. Especially when you have multiple widgets in different parts, you want to share code between you, or share data and share state between your widgets, it can become very complicated. And the rest of the solutions really kind of lift the state up higher in the tree. So rather than having the state directly in your widgets, you'd have it kind of at the top level, a single state, which all the widgets build from. The provider package, I really recommend if you're looking to learn more about Flutter after this talk. At I/O recently, there were 5 talks on Flutter. They're all excellent. But the one on state management is really worth watching. And if you watched last year's I/O, they talked about block being the answer to everyone's problems and kind of really pushed the community in that direction. In practice, block is very powerful, but can also be rather complex and can be hard for newer developers. The one key to block and why it was designed was to share Dart code between Flutter and Angular Dart, which in practice isn't a problem many developers have to solve. Thank you. I'll talk into the mic. So unless you are already building an Angular Dart app, you may or may not want block. Provider, I think, is kind of considered the best practice and the best starting point if you're building a Flutter app. And provider, as the name implies, enables a way for providing your state from the top to your individual widgets. MobX and Redux both come from the React world. This talk will focus on Redux and our experiences with it. But if you want something a bit more lightweight, MobX is a good choice. To be very transparent, although this talk is about Redux, I love Redux. I think it works really well with Flutter. It's not the most popular choice in Flutter. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. One is I think Flutter is new, so people think, well, state management should be new also. So a lot of Flutter developers aren't coming from necessarily a React background. They're coming from an Android background. So they kind of bring over their Android ideas into it. Again, I think block became very popular because of last year's I/O talk, whereas I think this year's I/O talk really focused on provider. So I think if you look at this coming up year, I think a lot of people will be using provider for state management. How many people have used Redux in an app before? Show of hands, Redux. All right, so about half of you, a good amount. So I'll just super quickly, here's Redux in a nutshell. So with Redux, you have your store, which is your state, tells you everything about the state of the application. The store builds the view, and the view dispatches actions, and it just loop, rinse, repeat, keep going over and over again. What I like about Redux is how it boils down even complex interactions to very simple concepts. That you have simply, that's all actions, right? Your view dispatches an action, and the action will update your state, and the view redraws. It's that very simple idea that, again, you keep just rinsing and repeating. The one thing I like about Redux, my background is sociology. I studied sociology and economics. I've always kind of felt like imposter syndrome, kind of just throwing code together, see what works. And Redux is the first time I really feel like an engineered an app. And I think part of that is because with Redux, I'm making less decisions. I think very often when you're coding, you're constantly deciding what goes where, and you're making it up as you go along. Whereas the Redux, it's a very structured approach. So again, you're making little choices. It kind of forces you into a certain approach. And that, to me, I found provided a much more stable application. Again, I'll say this is more because of Redux than Flutter, but our last app was one of the better apps we built. And you can tell kind of early on the number of bugs you find. I mean, all apps have bugs. That goes without saying. The question is, do you find 10 bugs, do you find 100 bugs? And the other question is, when you fix a bug, are there more bugs or less bugs? So with Redux, I have found it enables a pretty nice approach that you're constantly reducing bugs, just honing things in. And again, this works pretty well for us. So now we're going to talk about kind of how Redux interplays with Flutter. So again, I think the reason why Redux isn't more popular in Flutter, because again, it isn't necessarily the best fit. I think Flutter is a reactive framework, and Redux is a very structured approach. So I think there's a kind of inherent belief that a more reactive approach is a better match for Flutter. So for example, things like streams, which are much more kind of a fluid approach. But again, in my head, my mind hasn't adjusted to this kind of stream approach and reactive approach to development. And Redux, I think, although not the most popular approach, does work very well with Flutter. But let's talk about the problems. I think the biggest problem with Redux and Flutter is that this is again the natural kind of the purest implementation if any part of the Redux state changes, the whole app rebuilds. And that means even if you have multiple layers and you have multiple routes in your app and you can't see them on the screen and they're underneath, they're still going to get rebuilt. So that sounds really bad, and it is a problem you should be aware of. One thing to keep in mind, the way Flutter works is Flutter builds widgets, and the widgets then create render elements. So although the widgets rebuild, the widgets aren't what's on the screen. It's the render elements that's on the screen. So that there's a layer of abstraction inherent in Flutter, which optimizes it. So though you might rebuild all the widgets, the screen won't be flickering or redrawing. The screen will stay fixed. But there is kind of code being executed behind the scenes. So again, this is kind of the key point to remember with Redux, and I think its biggest problem, hands down, is that everything rebuilds. And a lot of what I'll talk about in this talk is approaches we use to compensate for that aspect of it. And the next slide is important in the memoization. So this is kind of a common computer science practice, but to a memoized function is very simply, if the inputs are the same, then the outputs are the same, and it caches your functions for you. So we use a lot of things like charting. So for example, if we're showing a chart to the user, we will use memoize to cache the results of the chart. And that way, as the widgets keep redrawing, the chart calculations are only run the first time. And so in Dart, there's just simply a memoize package you can use. It's very simple to use. You give it your inputs, give your outputs, and then it automatically does it for you, essentially. It just wraps that code for you. And it just enables it, rather than, although the widgets keep redrawing, the calculations are only run that one time. There is a trick in Redux. You can set the distinct property to true on a view model, and that'll prevent it from redrawing. And it sounds great. We started off doing that. In practice, I found it caused more bugs. That essentially, if you set distinct to true, you have to make sure that you override the equals equals operator. And remember, if you change your view model, to keep it up to date. And in practice, I would forget to do that. And I didn't find this made a big difference in performance. So it's possible to do it this way, but in our experience, it didn't actually help, and it just caused issues. And the last thing I mentioned is, if you have a Flutter Redux app, you don't want too many layers in your views. Because again, even though you can't see it, it will get rebuilt behind the scenes. So one approach we use is to just constantly kind of pop the stack and make sure the views aren't too deep. I won't go too much in detail into this slide. It's a bit more advanced, but I will mention that if you're getting started with Flutter, there's a Flutter samples repo that takes a single app. It's like a to-do app, and it implements it in a lot of different state management solutions. So it's really helpful as a starting point. I just want to point out that we use the Redux sample as the basis for our application, and it caused a number of problems with many months of rework. I would say the biggest mistake we made is not using built value. So in the Flutter world, there are a number of choices when dealing with serialization. So for example, you have your data objects, and you got to get them up to the wire and back. So you'll convert them from your data objects to JSON. And you want to convert it back from JSON to the data object. So out of the box, I use something called JSON serialization, which works. But if you're using Redux, you have to deal with immutability. And then it requires a lot more manual kind of code, tons and tons of manual code by hand, a lot of boilerplate code. So if you are using Flutter and you're using Redux, you definitely want to use a library called built value, and that will automate the code for you. It's kind of code generation. Highly recommended. And then I won't go into too much detail on these other points. The last one I'll mention is that there are a lot of Redux libraries in Flutter. You don't need them all. Just using Flutter Redux and Redux logging is all you really need. And I'll also say, if after this talk you decide to look into Flutter and work on it, feel free to reach out to me if you have other questions about implementation. I'm certainly happy to help. And all this code for our app and the apps I work on are all open source, so you can reference them, figure out how we built them, and use them in your app. This is just a quick example of kind of the code generation. So looking at a login class, username and password. And so using built value will kind of auto-generate all this code for you. So if you're using JSON serialization, you'd be writing a lot of this code by hand, which you probably don't want to do. It's very tedious code. So I highly recommend built value. All right, so let's go to some specific problems we want to solve for our application. And this persistence was kind of the main reason we built this app. So our initial invoice app, the big problem it had is if you switch from that app to another app, your state was gone. So for example, if you started creating an invoice and you switched to your email app to get your client's details and then switched back, the invoice you were creating would be erased. You have to start from scratch, which provides, obviously, as you can imagine, a very poor user experience. So the key to this app was great persistence implementation. So if I run this GIF, I show an example. So you'll see this is just creating a new client. And the idea here is as the user starts typing, enters in data, then decide to quit the app completely, when the app relaunches, we want to make sure they go back exactly to the page they were on with the data they were working on. And that's kind of it. The test is still there. And so the way we implement this, it's a bit tricky in Flutter. The problem is in Flutter, when you have activity states, so you could say, hey, when the application closes, you think that's when you want to save it. The problem is that doesn't really work well in Flutter, because at that point, you can only make a synchronous request. and most persistence libraries use asynchronous requests. So the way we solve this is we're constantly saving. So as the user is typing in the form, each key press, we're constantly re-persisting, and then we divide the state into kind of different top-level states. And the two key ones are data and UI. So for example, in this case, we're constantly re-persisting the UI state, but the data state is only persisted when data is loaded or when a kind of major data event occurs. And that gives us a pretty good solution where it gives us both kind of constantly storing persistence, but also then loading data as we need it. So view models. So again, the key question here is how do we divide code and how do we break it down? And so this is just a very simple view with 3 tabs. And the way we divide our code is that each view will have both a view file and a view model file. The view will handle the actual UI and stuff dealing with specifically with layout. And the view model will then be a backing file which handles things like business logic, domain logic. And so for example, looking at this page or this screen, you'll see the 3 tabs. So each tab has its own view and its own view model. And then we use a top-level view and view model to kind of coordinate the page as a whole. So for example, as you interact with a form and start typing, we're dealing with that view and that view model. Whereas the save at the top is kind of the top-level view model that deals with all kind of sub-pages. And it kind of coordinates everything together. I'll just talk about just passing data. There are lots of ways of passing data from the top down to the views. This may be a bit specific, but one approach we've taken is to we pass it all. We pass the full state down rather than kind of hardwiring individual properties. And we found in practice it just makes development much quicker. That all states available. We define functions to send actions back up, but to get data down, we just make it all available. And again, it's just a bit quicker to work with. So forms. Kind of forms are a big part of most apps we're building. And one of the keys here is that we use built value to create our objects. And what that does for us, and I'll show you if I run this GIF, is as you start typing in the form, you'll see the icon turns blue in the top right. It understands that you've changed the form. And what's cool is if you unchange the form, it understands that you've unchanged it. Essentially, with web in the web, what I would typically do is have a Boolean. You'd say you've changed it, is change is true. Whereas here, rather than tracking that, we're actually comparing the objects themselves. And by using built value, we can do infinitely complex objects and just see, is the old object equal to the new object or has it changed? Again, I think it provides a great UX. You'll tell the user, hey, I know you've made changes. These are your changes, and to undo the changes. Some kind of key points here. So with built value, you're essentially using annotations to map your objects to classes. And it's tempting to use nullable, to say, hey, these fields can be null, because some fields may be null. In practice, I would avoid it. What ends up happening is if you use nullable fields and you put it in a form, it looks like it's changed, because it compares null to an empty string, which is what the form will create. And so to be able to actually tell what's changed and what hasn't, you want to avoid using nullable properties wherever possible. Another problem you'll have with built value is if you create new objects, they'll look to be the same. So if I create 2 new clients, as far as built value is concerned, they're exactly the same, right? All the properties match up. They're all blank and they're all equal. And so we use negative counters to track the differences. So essentially, if you create a new object, like a new client in the app, we'll set its ID to -1. You create another one, will be -2. And that way, the app can disambiguate between unsaved records. Once you save the record, we then get a positive ID. So that essentially allows us to tell the difference between uncreated or unsaved records. And then once they're saved, again, the negative ID becomes positive. And the last thing I'll talk about is completers. And this is kind of how we choreograph a lot of the code in the app. So let's go through navigation example. So a classic app is there are dependencies between the objects. So in this case, we're looking at the new task form. So in our app, Invoice Ninja, a task belongs to a project belongs to a client. So in the old version of the app, we would require the user to follow a very certain workflow. We'd have to first make sure the client exists, then they make sure the project exists, and then they can create the task, which links to it. With the Flutter app, we're now able to reverse it. So if I play this GIF, you'll see what's happening. You're going to type into the project. You can create a new project. And then for the new project, it's asking for clients. You can select a new client. And then now we're in this new client field. We can then type the client name and then start popping them back off. And we'll say the new client. And now we're back to the project form with the client selected. Set the project name. And then it takes you back to the task form with the client and project selected. So it lets you kind of essentially reverse the workflow. You can either go kind of client first, then project and task, or the opposite, and do task, then project and client. And this is all enabled using completers. And this is how we kind of implement separation of concerns. So the view model will deal with a lot of the view interactions. It'll then dispatch a completer. When the middleware finishes its job, it completes the completer, which tell the view model, hey, move forward and do the next thing. Just so an example of how to implement it in code, This is kind of a helper function we created called a snack bar completer. And so what it does is the first line highlighted saying it's creating a new completer. And then this is kind of Dart code for completers. You're saying completer.future.then, and it's saying essentially when the completer succeeds, I'm going to call this scaffold method, or scaffold of. And .of you'll see all over Flutter code. And .of essentially uses inherited widgets to find the next scaffold looking up the widget tree. One thing worth mentioning about Flutter is it's all about trees. That's how they think about it. It's all just trees, trees of elements. And so the .of essentially is just saying, hey, look up the tree. And show snack bar will just show a message. And then we have the error handling in this function. Essentially, if an error occurs, we just show an error dialog with the error details. And then I'll show you this is how it's used in code. We'll have kind of a list of actions. And in this case, with the archive action, we'll just dispatch an archive invoice request, and we'll pass it a snack bar completer. And that's what handles both success and failure cases. So if it succeeds, it shows a little snack bar message at the bottom. And if it fails, it shows a pop-up with the error details to the user. But again, it finds a nice way to kind of abstract kind of a very common use case of handle the success, handle failure. And then again, we'll just use this throughout the application. And we'll have different types of completers. We'll have a snack bar completer which shows a message, or a pop completer which just pops the route after it succeeds. The last thing to talk about with the app development is our use of a code generator. And so what we found early on with Invoice Ninja application is that many of the parts of the app are very similar. We'll have a list of clients, a list of invoices, a list of products. I'm sure you've seen apps like this. Kind of the term is a CRUD app: create, replace, update, delete. And so rather than kind of just retype the same code over and over again, what we did was we took out the code from the app and made a separate project on GitHub. And it's called the Redux code generator. And it enables you to essentially take a single module, kind of like an email mail merge, and then kind of copy and paste it, the entire module, throughout the application. So for Invoice Ninja, it was super helpful. That way we built the first module, which was the client module. And then for any additional module, we just simply run the command to rerun and reinstantiate the next module. So this approach has kind of pros and cons. A big pro is it reduced a lot of code we had to write by hand. We could just kind of automate the code generation, which is excellent. But the problem is if we made mistakes, which obviously we did, you're essentially duplicating your mistakes. So anything we got wrong in the first module, by the time we created our 10th module, we then had 10 places we need to update. So at this point, I think it's reasonably solid. If you're building a CRUD-style Redux app, it's something worth reviewing and considering. But again, it depends on your particular use cases. But again, it has worked pretty well for us. Let's talk about best practices. So if you're new to Flutter and you're building a Flutter app, some things to keep in mind. By default, when you create a Flutter app, you don't get an analysis options file, and that's a linter, if you guys are familiar with C coding or C++. And it gives you kind of just best practices for writing the best code possible. The Flutter team uses their own analysis options file, which is much stricter than what you get out of the box. So I would certainly suggest if you're building a serious Flutter app, one of the first things you want to do is take the Flutter team's analysis options file and add it to your code base. And I found personally it was a great way of learning Dart, kind of particularly best practices. We did this kind of a few months into the project, which is a big mistake. We ended up with thousands of warnings, and we actually hired a third-party company to help us to eliminate them. But if you're just getting started, it's a great day one action to take, because again, it'll just kind of guide your hand and show you some things you may or may not know about Dart. Server-side error logging. My background's in web development. We have error logs. Switching to mobile, I was surprised by how little logging we had, and I certainly recommend using either Sentry.io or Crashlytics. We are using Sentry. We found it worked really well out of the box. The one thing you find about Flutter versus other platforms is that, and I have a bit of experience developing for iOS and Android, small errors like a null pointer exception on iOS, the whole app will crash instantly, right? Instantly crash, wherever they're up to, it's done. And there's a benefit to that your user knows something went wrong. And they will tell you, hey, when I did this, it broke, fix it, right? With Flutter, that doesn't happen. With Flutter, very often, especially with null pointer exceptions, the app won't crash. It'll keep running. Just that one part of the UI that's referenced in the crash will fail. And we found in practice, users simply don't notice it. They'll just keep using the app, and you get far fewer bug reports. So when we first launched the app, we're like, we built a bug-free app, right? No one's complaining. We finally did it. In truth, it was just that people weren't noticing the bugs, that they were there. There were tons of bugs. But again, if the app doesn't crash, they're not kind of told, hey, it really failed. And once we went live with Crashlytics, we actually went live with Sentry.io, we immediately found out, hey, we have problems. But without the visibility, you just don't know what you need to fix. So I highly recommend it from day one to implement some sort of third-party logging. Built value, I mentioned that before. If you're using immutability in Flutter, you definitely want to be using built value. Create tons of widgets. This is kind of an approach just writing good Flutter code. I think if people want to criticize Flutter, sometimes you'll see it can be hard to match the parentheses. And a lot of that comes down to having very deep nested widget trees. And the solution to that is creating lots of tiny widgets. And we create widgets for the simplest, smallest things like an icon text. It's just a picture, an icon next to a text message. But having a separate widget for that enables us throughout our code base to reuse that single widget. Things like layout, theming, styling, we have it all isolated in one place. And it makes the code just a lot more readable. And then finally, I would say if you're using Flutter Redux, generally you use packages, you just don't look at the code. I know I don't. But the Flutter Redux library is incredibly short. It's just one file with about 300 lines of commented code. So if you really want to get into Flutter, and particularly Redux, the best advice I can give you is just simply to read the code base. It's incredibly well commented, and that's really how I think I got a good sense for how it actually works behind the scenes. So to get back to the app, so here's the app we had. We had this app about a year ago. We spent the past year developing. And actually, the quick story is me and the mobile developer switched. So my background is web, and I became a mobile developer. And he's a mobile developer, and he's now working on a new web version. And then, so we developed the app, and then new version, much better. So really, people really like the app. We're now 4.6. It's hard. People give us 1-star reviews because they can't log in. It's very frustrating. But on the whole, our users tell us regularly that they love the new app. It's really changed the way they relate with our software. And then let's talk about kind of where we're going from here. So again, we spent this past year developing these 2 mobile apps. So we're now live in both stores, Android and Apple. And where we're going from here is now to desktop. So if you're following Google I/O, Google recently announced that they're now supporting Flutter for everywhere. So our plan, right now we have an Electron app. So we take a little bit of our web app and we wrap it in an Electron wrapper, and people kind of use it and kind of like it. Our plan now is to do the opposite. We're rather going from web and bringing it down, we're going to go from mobile and bring it up. So essentially what is now our mobile app over the next few months will be a tablet and desktop app. And in the future, web. So we are now working on version 2, and if you follow Google I/O, they made a massive announcement that now Flutter will now work in the web also. I've started using it. It is awesome. It is much better than I was expecting. We actually were they announced it initially in like Hummingbird about a few months ago. And to me, honestly, I thought it was kind of like smoke and mirrors because they weren't showing anything real. They were showing like a little toy app. And I was like, they kind of did it for a little sample app, but you can't really use it in production or anything like that. And then more recently, I got a chance to use the Flutter Gallery, which has every single Flutter widget running in it, and it's solid. I mean, it works really well. So we decided rather than take, rather than we were rebuilding a web app, it just doesn't make sense anymore. So our plan now is to take our mobile app and to make it our new web app. And I think it fits well for our use case. It's a pretty straightforward Redux application. There aren't any kind of advanced plugins being used. So, and that's really, if you think about Flutter for web, it's the plugins that I think are really kind of the question mark right now, because there simply aren't any, and there won't be for some time. But if you're building a complex Flutter app, being able to then deploy it both mobile, desktop, and web is hard to beat. Right? A year ago, I had 3 separate code bases: a web code base, an Android code base, and an iPhone code base. So to have a single code base, which we support across all 3 platforms, will be amazing. And that kind of is our big picture plan. I will just mention, I find in Israel, most people are on LinkedIn but aren't on Twitter. From my experience, the conversation with Flutter really in large part is on Twitter. So even if you don't write anything on Twitter, if you're curious about Flutter and really want to get into it, I strongly recommend just creating an empty Twitter account and follow some of these people. They all work on the Flutter team. You'll find they really kind of share a lot on Twitter. And I just would recommend, especially if you want to get serious about Flutter, this is a great way to do it. I also quickly mention there is a Flutter Meetup in Israel, which I've been to in the past. So if you're curious about Flutter, join the Flutter Meetup. If you search for Flutter Israel on meetup.com, you'll find it. And then lastly, I'll just share quickly, if you get into Flutter, a website I helped develop is something called itsallwidgets.com. And so Google were really nice. Initially, Google had their own showcase, but it was very hard to get into. So myself, along with some friends, we developed itsallwidgets.com, which is an open listing. So if anyone in this room ends up building a Flutter app, please submit it at itsallwidgets.com. We try to highlight really interesting apps. Google were kind enough to link to us from their main website, which really got us a lot of traction with a lot of traffic. And then we also have a podcast. So if anyone's interested in being on a Flutter podcast or sharing their experiences, it'd be great to have you on the podcast. Just contact me afterwards. I'm pretty accessible. And that's pretty much it. So I'm on Twitter. You can follow me, Hillel Coren. My website is hillel.dev. I wrote a more in-depth blog post series about Flutter and Redux, which you can find on my website. And I'd also say if anyone from this room ends up getting into Flutter and needs help or has questions, feel free to reach out to me. Happy to help. And if any questions, happy to take them. Yeah, thanks. Thanks.
Why did you choose Flutter over React Native, for example?
That's a good question. So we were tempted by React Native for a long time. I was following it very closely. I think React Native is awesome. So I'm not going to talk negatively about other technology, because again, I really believe React Native is a very amazing technology, but I will highlight some of what I think I see at the benefits of Flutter. The biggest one, in my opinion, is the fact that it's all built by one company. So with React Native, it does everything, but very often you're relying on third-party packages for core features, things like navigation. Whereas with Flutter, it's all done by Google, right? Everything, testing, profiling, development, it's all one company. And in practice, I found that with updates, it works very well with Flutter. Whereas React Native, especially it can be challenging when you update to know if things continue to work. And it's not React Native's fault, it's just the nature of the beast, right? If you have all these different developers working on their own, building things, that's very hard. I have a very long background in JavaScript, and I don't like it. I mean, I've been doing it for years. It's challenging. JavaScript isn't the best language. I think I'm particularly burnt because we're building an invoicing app. And if you guys know math and JavaScript, it's almost a joke. It's like 0.1 and 0.2 does not equal 0.3 in JavaScript, right? It's just, and it amazes me that this is the best we could do, right? This is the language you're all using. So I think JavaScript, I think even the people who created JavaScript are amazed it's being used as widely as it is. Things like TypeScript is very cool, and Flow, these are very cool. These are built on top of to kind of solve these problems. With Dart, it's kind of from scratch, brand new, best practices. We know everything we didn't know then. And it's just a very nice language. So those are a few reasons. I'd also say I think if you compare the two languages now, the two frameworks, Dart, or I should say Flutter and React Native, they're somewhat comparable right now. I think React Native has some great benefits, has a very big community, lots of packages. But I like the Wayne Gretzky quote. He talks about how he's such a good hockey player. He skated where the puck was going, right? So I think if you extrapolate where Flutter is going to be in a few years from now, the ecosystem is growing at a tremendous rate. Packages being developed incredibly quickly. And now the ability to develop once and have it on web and desktop, I think is very enticing. So I think maybe a year ago, maybe React Native was a consideration. Whereas I think if you develop something brand new, then I don't see any major reasons to use React Native over Flutter, unless, again, but it depends on your specific use case. There are specific reasons. For example, if you need the native UI toolkits, right? It has to be native UI widgets. Then React Native does that for you. Flutter doesn't. But again, in my experience, most apps don't need that, right? Most apps need the best app experience possible, and I don't think you need React Native to accomplish that. So.
Can you create just one module of your app in Flutter and the rest not? Like you do in React Native, or you have to have the entire app in Flutter?
You can do it any way. You can either do a full Flutter app with a little bit of an Android app in it, or the reverse, or a big Android app with a little bit of Flutter in it. Those are a bit newer. They do work. They're kind of experiments, I would say, but they work. But it's easiest, obviously, just do pure Flutter top to bottom, is the approach we took. But it is possible to mix and match. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Any large-scale companies which are leveraging Flutter?
Good question. Yeah. So the famous one right now is Alibaba. They're huge, obviously, and they have an app with about 50 million users. So it's massive. It's not known in the West. It's an app just used in China. But they're like the example people go to is, hey, they're massive. And then if you look at newer apps, just recently, eBay, Sonos, some big companies are just starting to announce it. So I think when we started about a year ago, there weren't big app companies, kind of more experiments. The biggest ones were in Google themselves. So for example, Google used it for the Nest Home. If you announced, they saw the big Nest Home announcement, the Home Hub. So we're just starting to see much bigger apps. But things are moving in that direction. And from our experience, it's great technology. It works pretty well. I don't see any scalability issues. Yeah. Any other questions? Cool. All right.
The current version is still not RC, right?
Release candidate?
Is it?
Yeah, I mean 1.0. It was 1.0 as of December, and they just announced 1.5 at I/O, and it's designed to be production. Their web version is now a technical preview, so their web and desktop are not production ready. They're telling you, hey, these are experiments, try it. But their mobile solutions are very production ready. Yeah. Cool. All right. Thank you very much.
Cool.